I will record tonight because, well, for a few reasons, really. The person who asked us to look at Revelation isn't able to be here tonight. And the musicians are also out tonight playing at the college as well. So we've only got the non-musical people here tonight, if you like. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at Revelation 13. And I'd really love it if people interrupted at some points. I'd hate to think you couldn't interrupt. So if people want to interact, I'll try and get us talking a little bit at parts just to help you reflect on things. But please just have the freedom just to interrupt, and that would be a joy if you did that. So yes, tonight we've got this lovely, straightforward topic of Revelation 13 and the beasts and the dragon and the Antichrist and the mark of the beast and the whole kit and caboodle. There have been hundreds of books, and I dare say maybe even thousands of books that have been written on this subject and related subjects to this. And those books are a bit like fingerprints, where no two books are the same. Nobody seems to completely agree with each other on every detail of this passage and the related passages. And so I think we need to approach this with some amount of humility tonight. There have been hundreds of candidates as to who these beasts represent, who is the Antichrist, often associated with the beast. Just out of interest, have people heard interesting candidates for the beast, the Antichrist, or for the mark of the beast?
I have to confess that I looked at two books, started to read and gave up because they were so different. I thought, I'll wait for Mark to give an authoritative interpretation.
Yes, we're going to put the record straight once for all tonight. Yes, that's how we do things. I don't know how much light we're going to shed on it, but yeah, that's part of the problem. Certainly, yeah. Have we had any interesting candidates? What is
they certainly used to say Gorbachev, didn't they?
Oh yes,
the mark
yeah.
on his head. He was.
Wasn't that part of the mark on the head? Yeah.
But
yeah.
I'm not sure of any others.
They not repeated things in different ages, that they represent something.
Yes, yeah, that's one working theory, isn't it? Yeah, that either Revelation spans the whole of history or it applies to any point in history, because there are always beastly personalities who bear these kind of marks to their regimes. Yes, that would be one theory. Yeah. There's also been a lot recently, COVID vaccines and COVID passports and that sort of thing. Lots of new theories that come up in every generation. One of the problems is ideas have consequences. So back in probably the 1970s and 80s, something like that, there were pockets of Christians, I heard from some recently, particularly over in America, who had, because they were so influenced by particular theories of who the beast was and the mark of the beast, and therefore when Jesus was returning, according to their sort of timescale of things, that these sort of groups of Christians had decided not to have children, not to go to university because it was all pointless. What's the point in starting a university course if Jesus is coming back very soon? What's the point in having children if they're going to potentially live under the Antichrist and the mark of the beast? And so those Christians would now be in their 50s and 60s, and Christ didn't return, and the Antichrist had not been revealed, and now some of those Christians are without the education that they would have otherwise got, or without the children and grandchildren they would have otherwise raised. I watched one video recently. Goodness knows how many videos I've watched, trying to get my head around some things. But I watched one video recently on YouTube. One of the top comments underneath was a fairly young lady saying my dad, she was saying this positively, saying my dad's been stocking up our cellar for months now so that we've got enough food for when the mark of the beast comes, because then we won't be able to buy and sell. So got a cellar full of this food simply because she thought, Well, clearly it's imminent based on these theories I've been told. But every generation makes these theories about world figures being an apocalyptic antichrist. Every generation claims that the current events of their day are the mark of the beast or of some uniting world power against God's people, and that Christ is going to return any minute, and 100% of them have been wrong so far. One day somebody will be right, I suppose. But I think we need to have some humility as we approach this. So let's dive in. We'll open up Revelation 13. If I put it on the screen for you, so that you can see. If somebody could read it to us in a moment, but let me just give a brief sort of introduction so we know what to look for as we're reading. This is, of course, the start of the chapter 13 in our Bibles, but as John wrote it, we know there's no chapter divisions. This is continuing the scene from chapter 12. And in chapter 12, do you remember the woman and the dragon, where you have Satan, the dragon, pursuing Christ and pursuing Christ's followers? We read about the birth of Jesus, how he's protected from the dragon's assassination attempts. So the dragon, then we're told at the end of the chapter, he was so enraged at the woman who gives birth to the child, who we learn is Jesus, that he wages war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast to the testimony about Jesus. So we're told that the dragon, at the end of this is the climactic part of chapter 12, the dragon is going to wage war against those who hold fast to their testimony of Jesus, Christians. So they're going to wage war against Christians. Chapter 13 is then giving us the devil's strategy. How does the devil wage war against Christians? The dragon employs two henchmen. This is the devil's strategy. He has two henchmen. They're described as two beasts. So the scene opens with the dragon, Satan, on the shore of the sea, where the land and the sea meet, and he's going to call a beast out of each, out of the land and out of the sea, two henchmen to do his bidding and to wage his war on his behalf. Okay, so let's read about the first beast. Could somebody just read the first 10 verses for us on the screen there?
The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. And they also worshipped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it?" The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them, and it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people.
Lovely. Thank you, Kay. I'll just leave that up because we're going to have a little think about the use of the Old Testament in this. This is key to understanding Revelation. So just have a look through if you haven't already and just think about, do I recognize any of this language from the Old Testament? And while you do that, let me just say something about Old Testament language, because you can barely get through a sentence in Revelation without being bombarded with images and symbols and references and allusions to Old Testament passages. This is one of the reasons that Revelation sounds so strange to our ears, is because the language of the Old Testament is not as familiar as it should be. Revelation is the last book of the Bible for a reason, because we're meant to have read the other 65 books before we get to it. So we're meant to know what the rest of the book's about. If you imagine somebody learning English and then and they had enough English to be able to converse with an English person, then they came to England, went to London and heard somebody using all these colloquialisms and Cockney rhyming slang about going up the apples and pears and washing their boat race. Suddenly they know English. This English sounds very strange to them. Well, almost that can be how many Christians are, that we're conversant with New Testament language, but we haven't really grasped some of the Old Testament language, which is why the book of Revelation can sound very strange. But this is loaded with Old Testament images. So verse 1, the dragons by the sea. Just to start off, can you think of any ways in which the sea is used in the Old Testament? What things it's used to symbolize?
Jonah.
Yeah, well, in Jonah it was sort of judgment and death, wasn't it? In the heart of the sea for 3 days and 3 nights. Yeah. So yeah, judgment and death. Judgment's often spoken of as a flood. We obviously got the flood in the Old Testament as well. Yeah. Anything else we see?
Crossing the Red Sea.
Yeah. Again, a judgment on the Egyptians, wasn't it? And even in baptism, we see that sort of death pictures as people go down, the idea of either death or judgment. Yes. The wicked are thrown into the sea, aren't they? In Revelation, as it picks up some of those images, Babylon's thrown like a great millstone into the sea, into death and judgment. The sea give up their dead at the end, that sort of thing. Also, the sea can represent evil and chaos and the nations as well. Later on we read that the angel said, "The waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations and languages." The waters represent the nations. That's one way this is used as well. But also, out of the sea come monsters in the Bible. This is one of the things about the sea, is why it's linked to evil and death and judgment and chaos sometimes. So Job and Psalms and Isaiah all speak about sea monsters and sea serpents. Do you remember that there's a special name given to a particular sea monster in those books?
Leviathan.
Leviathan, right. This sort of agent of chaos and evil, who the Lord's going to slay with his sword. So Isaiah 27 says, "In that day the Lord will punish with his sword the great, fierce and powerful sword, Leviathan, the gliding serpent, or monster, really, snake or dragon, if you like. Leviathan, the coiling serpent, he will slay the monster of the sea." So Revelation is probably picking up on some of those images. In fact, there are a couple of chapters that have 2 beasts in them in the Old Testament. Can you think of a chapter that has 2 particular beasts in it? One of them is Leviathan and the other is the behemoth. Remember in Job, you got these 2 beasts side by side. Maybe John has that in mind. I don't know, but there is one passage that Revelation 13 is quoting the most. And does anybody know what that is? Where does this language come from? Do you know?
I would guess Daniel, but I think I could be wrong.
Yeah, it is Daniel. Yes. So Daniel chapter 7. Thanks, John. Yeah, if I'll just go onto this screen here. Let's just give you an example. Some of the main points where Daniel sees 4 beasts. 3 come first, and then there's a 4th. Revelation, we have two beasts. One comes first and then a second. But very similar. So Daniel's is a vision. He looks and he sees, and the same thing we have at the beginning. John sees a vision of beasts. They come up out the sea in both cases. We're told that the first is like a lion, the second's like a bear, the third's like a leopard. Well, the first beast is like a lion, bear, and leopard in Revelation as well. It's given authority to rule, same is said in Revelation. The fourth beast had 10 horns, same in Revelation. About a beast with 10 horns. We also have a little horn that was given a mouth that spoke boastfully. Revelation 13. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words, speak boastfully. The beast is slain, we're told in Daniel. Others are stripped of authority but allowed to live a while. And the same sort of thing happens in Revelation, where one of the beasts seems to die, but actually that death is reversed. Do you know in Daniel, what are the beasts representing? Because this is what Revelation is drawing on. What are the beasts representing in Daniel? Generally speaking, what are the beasts?
Evil, I suppose.
Yes, okay, say that again.
Evil. I don't
Yeah,
know.
evil in the form of kingdoms. Yeah, evil kingdoms.
Because
So
Daniel
four
was given an interpretation, wasn't he, of this particular thing?
Yes, so we don't have to guess. And if Revelation's drawing on this language, then we've already got an interpretation of what this kind of language means. So it wouldn't need to be interpreted to John, because he'd know, oh, this is Daniel 7. I'm being given the same language. So yeah, 4 kingdoms that would oppose God. Now, in terms of the identity of those kingdoms, the interpretations will abound. And there may be great value in saying, well, what are these 10 horns, or what are these 7 heads and these crowns and these all these different elements? There may be value in that, but don't lose the big picture. The big picture is simple, that world powers, political powers, kingdoms, empires, will oppose God's people. Not all to the same extent, but there are political powers that will oppose God's people throughout history. So whether you're living under the Roman Empire or communist China or communist North Korea, Soviet Union, Middle East, or just in our own sort of secular, godless, pagan age, in our particular culture, to some extent they will oppose our faith in various ways. It will look very different from the Romans compared to the British in a secular, godless society, but nevertheless they will oppose the Christian faith in some form. Is there any language in Revelation to suggest that this beast is also a political power? So if I go back to Revelation 13, is there any language here that suggests that, like Daniel, the beast here is also political? It's a government, it's a kingdom, it's an empire.
Well, the Roman emperors were worshipped as gods, didn't they? And it says in verse 4, people worship the dragon because he'd be given authority to the beast. They also worship the beast. That's who is like the beast, who can wage war against it. So
yep. that would certainly fit with many emperors.
So it says all inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, yeah.
That could be just the known earth, the Roman Empire at that stage.
Yes, it certainly could be, yeah. Because in the day in which John is living in his world, yeah, there were emperors who claimed divinity, varying degrees. Look, there's a lot of political language here that makes clear this is a political figure or empire. So look through, we've got...
well, I thought it was talking about the Romans.
Yeah.
Because it talks about them, what is it, from verse 6.
Yeah, go on.
And slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over. So it's like the corruption that Rome had in Israel and in Jerusalem over the tribes of Israel.
Yeah.
From my understanding.
They certainly blasphemed God's name. The Romans certainly slandered his holy dwelling place as well in the temple. And they waged war against God's people as well. Yeah.
But why does it say that and to conquer them? That's what I couldn't understand. God's people. God's holy people and to conquer them.
Well, it did, didn't it? I mean, in that sense, God's people have lived through some pretty tyrannical empires who have seemed to conquer them. Just as Christ looked as if he was conquered on the cross.
Yeah.
Because
Human power to wage war against God's
human triumph looks very different to God's triumph. But I think this is very clearly a political figure here, or at least an empire or kingdom, because look at the language. Verse 1, we've got crowns. Verse 2, we've got thrones. Verse 4 and 7, as mentioned, waging war. Well, that's a sort of a political thing, isn't it? Conquering, verse 7. Nations and tribes and peoples. This is sort of governmental, empire-wide language. In Revelation 13, we're told that the dragon gives this political power to the beast. So the beast is this leader, this ruler of some kind of a political nature. It's not an accident, therefore, that the governments of the world have opposed Christians. That's not an accident. It is a strategy of Satan, because he gives power to the beast. It's a strategy of Satan to use governments and kingdoms and leaders to oppose believers in Jesus. What do you notice about the animals that make up the beast in Daniel and Revelation? I know I haven't got Daniel in front of you.
Both this.
Yeah, they're the same animals. But sorry, John, say it again. Sorry.
Just that they're the same animals, but the question then is, but why? Why would a leopard, a bear, and a lion? I don't know. Yes,
and the theories abound as to the details, and I don't really know. It's interesting that when Paul was on trial and escaped trial from what would have been the emperor of the day, Nero, that he said, "I escaped the lion's mouth," and here we have a beast as a lion, the lion's mouth. But in Daniel, there were 4 separate beasts with these 4 animals. Here they're joined together in one. It's a combination, you see, of Daniel's beasts. So either, some would say, well, this is the climactic opposition of governments to God's people at the end of history. Some would say, well, no, it's all of the world powers of John's day against God's people, all of them combined together. Or maybe it's all throughout history. You've had all these different empires. They're all like this beast of various creeds and cultures opposing God's people. Whatever it is, don't miss the wood for the trees. The point is that one of the dragon's henchmen is political. That one of the strategies of Satan has one of the ways in which he wages war against those who have a testimony about Jesus is through political means, governments, kingdoms, empires. Okay. In fact, when you go back to the beginning of the book, we see that's the case in Pergamum. And in chapter 2 in Pergamum, it says, "You live where Satan has his throne." So Satan is seen, the dragon is seen through political arms. And the application is very clear to this, isn't it? I mean, we can try and digest all this and say, yeah, but what's the point? Well, he tells us the point. Although some things are not clear here, the point is very clear, because at the end of verse 10, he says, God's people need to have this patience, endurance, and faithfulness, because you're going to have to live through some pretty rough times and some beastly kings. Okay. Can we just read about the second henchman? So here's where we get the second beast and where we get the mark of the beast as well. Could somebody read this to us from verse 11?
Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom, that the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666.
Great. Thank you, Alan. Okay, so the first beast is definitely a political henchman. A lot of the political language of waging war and that sort of thing has gone here for the second beast. So it doesn't look so much like a political leader. What kind of leader would you say it is?
A dictator or an emperor?
It could be, but
Essentially.
I don't think that the emphasis is so much on political leaders, governments, empires, but on a different sphere of life. You might say a different kind of leader. I hope I'm not
Compromise and deception.
Yes, yeah. Oh, that certainly plays a part. Yeah, deceptive leader. I may be being a bit obtuse here, so I'll just say I think it's more a religious leader. It looks more like a religious leader. Got some more religious language here, so he looks like a lamb, the religious sacrifice. He performs signs, as in miracles, in verse 13, which look like some of those Old Testament miracles, you know, fire from heaven, that sort of thing. He sets up an image in verse 13 and gives life to that image. This is temple language of idols and statues. So the second big picture is that the dragon, Satan's strategies for persecuting Christians, are through religious persecution as well, through religious leaders and organizations. Now, imagine you're living in the first century, reading this book for the first time. You're living in the Church of Philadelphia, and this letter comes to you. Would this image ring true for you, that Satan uses religious leaders to persecute Christians? Of course it would,
Yes.
wouldn't it? Where do we read of that happening in the New Testament? Religious leaders persecuting believers.
The Jewish leaders.
Yes.
Pontius. You've got
That was
We have got political leaders like Pilate. We've also got religious leaders, haven't we, like King Herod, king of the Jews, and the Sanhedrin and the elders and chief priests and so on and so forth, Pharisees and Sadducees, persecuting Christians just as they persecuted Jesus. So Jesus was opposed by both political and religious, both the Romans and the Jewish leaders, right? Pilate and the Roman soldiers on one hand, Herod and the chief priests on the other. Jesus' followers will also be persecuted by political and religious pressure from both sides. Both beasts persecuted Jesus, both beasts will persecute his followers. The language here describing the religious beast is very Jewish language, isn't it? The beast comes from the earth, we're told. Now, that's not the word for world. World can have lots of meanings in the Bible. The word earth has two main meanings. It means the ground, which could mean planet Earth, but very often it means the land, as in the promised land, the land of Israel, the place that God gave to his people. So this beast comes from the land, which may suggest a Jewish leader coming from the promised land, may suggest the Jewish authorities. It looks like a lamb, looks like the Messiah, got horns like a lamb, but he speaks like a dragon. And he performs signs like the prophets performed in the Old Testament. This seems like a religious authority. And this would ring true for the Christians, wouldn't it? They suffered persecution at the hands of some of those religious authorities. Not from all Jews, of course. Very important to say, not from all Jewish people. Jesus was Jewish. John's Jewish. Peter, Paul, they were Jewish people. most of the characters in the New Testament are Jewish, but they were Jewish authorities, beastly authorities, that did persecute Jesus and his followers. But here, the religious powers, the second beast, are in leagues with the political powers. So these beasts are working together. So at verse 12, it exercised the authority of the first beast on its behalf. Verse 14, it ordered them to set up an image in honor of the first beast. So they're in leagues together. Verse 15, the second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast. Dangerous when political powers and religious powers are in leagues together in this way. I think one of the troubling things that we see in Russia at the moment is that there are those in the Orthodox Church who are quite, and I'm no expert on this, but seem to be quite supportive of Putin and the taking of Ukraine. It can be dangerous when religious and political powers get together in this kind of a way.
Rome,
Sorry?
the Pope. And
Yes, and of course, there's some quite damning stories of connections between Christians during the Second World War who were either sympathetic or didn't speak up against political powers. I mean, that's obviously a travesty. But yeah, so here we have political and religious united together against believers. Was that true in John's day? Were the political and religious powers in leagues with each other? Yes. That's what we read about, isn't it? That Pilate and Herod didn't like each other, but after persecuting Jesus, they became friends. Shall I crucify your king, said Pilate. We have no king but Caesar, said the chief priests. They sell out for Caesar. They say, no, we're friends with Caesar. He's our king. Right? So political and religious coming together to persecute Christ and his followers. Obviously, have it in the book of Acts as well, don't we? Revelation chapter 2 and 3. Twice we're told, to Smyrna and then to Philadelphia, it says, I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews but are not. They are really a synagogue of Satan. So there, the dragon's power is being seen through the religious authorities. They're not true Jews. They claim to be. They look like lambs, but they speak like dragons. Okay. Now we come to the mark of the beast. I'll try and squeeze as much in as we can and try and leave enough time so we can chat a bit as well. The first thing we're told, verse 16, just look at verse 16, that the mark is given on the right hand or on the forehead. Daniel told me before he texted me last week from Colombia to say he raised this, or it was raised in their theological training course as to whether the COVID vaccine is the mark of the beast. And the lecturer quickly replied, he said, well, it's not for me because I had it in my left arm. You know, the mark of the beast meant to be in the right arm or the right hand or on the forehead. Certainly not, you wouldn't have the COVID vaccine in your forehead, I wouldn't have thought. Now, what Old Testament language is this drawing on? That I've trawled through information on this, written and visual as well. And I can't find anybody who refers to this, but I think it's quite clear. What is this language of the mark on the right hand or forehead? Is that anywhere in the Old Testament? The hand and the forehead ever put together?
Was it something to do with the priests? I don't know. No, I can't.
The priests may have done. Yes, I didn't have that in mind, but you may be right about that, John. Yes.
I don't.
Can you think about the law and their practices are described as being written on the hand and the forehead?
Oh,
yeah. And obviously some of the Jewish people took that very literally, didn't they? And had these phylacteries that they actually wore in Jesus' day. And he criticised them for the size of their phylacteries. But yeah, Exodus 13.
Something around their head or something.
Yes, it actually ties, because that's what it says, isn't it? To tie it to your forehead, the idea of fixing it in place. So yeah, you've got Exodus 13, where we're told that the Passover and the sacrifice of a firstborn animal will be like a sign on your hand and like a symbol on your forehead, that the Lord brought you out of Egypt. Same Deuteronomy, but of the law, it says, when God gave you the covenant, you to fix the words to your hearts and minds, tie them as symbols to your hands, and your forehead. So in other words, God's way of life, his law, his words, his religious festivals were like signs on their hands and foreheads. It was symbolic, Deuteronomy says, that your heart and your mind were to be shaped by God and his word and his law. So it showed which master you served, because you were always thinking about God's law. You're using your hands, you were doing God's way of life. Here in Revelation, the opposite seems to be true, where your hearts and minds would serve another master, a beastly master, because you would, as it were, have a mark on your forehead and on your hand, not of God's law, but of the beast, of that master. I think John definitely has this in mind, because in the very next chapter, chapter 14, he contrasts it. What are they doing in chapter 14? At the very next thing he says, after saying that the mark of the beast is the number of this name, the name of this master, the very next thing he says in chapter 14, then I looked, and before me was a lamb standing on Mount Zion, with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. Okay, so the people of this world have the mark of, or the name of the beast written on their foreheads, but God's people called out of the world, out of Egypt, have the name of their father, their master, and of the lamb on their foreheads. Okay, so two masters, two ways of life, and whatever master you serve, that master will make a mark upon you, a mark on your life, a mark on your heart and your mind. Many Christians have the idea that it's physical, the mark of the beast. So there'll be a physical mark on your hand, there'll be a physical mark written, a number written on your head and that sort of thing. But nobody thinks that the mark of the lamb on the foreheads is a physical thing. You can't tell that somebody's a Christian by lifting up their fringe and finding the name of the Father and the Lamb written on the foreheads, right? Likewise, you can't tell that somebody serves another master, a beastly master, by looking at their hands and their foreheads. But you can tell what master you serve by their heart and their minds, the way they think, the things they love, the way they live, the things they desire, right? This is the mark upon the life. Verse 17 has these words. We'll move on as quickly as we can, but please do interrupt if you want to. Verse 17 has these words about not doing your shopping unless you've got the mark of the beast. You can't buy and sell. And so some Christians have come up with all sorts of ideas. The mark of the beast is barcodes, or when credit cards came out, the mark of the beast are credit cards and microchips and that sort of thing. Firstly, I don't know of anybody who has their credit cards written on their forehead and right hand. But secondly, the mark of the beast is verse 17, is the number of the beast's name. I don't know of many barcodes and credit cards that have the number of a world leader written on them. So John says, to work it out, in verse 18, he says we've got to calculate it. It requires calculation to those who have understanding. The idea here is to do what's called Gemetria, which is a Hebrew technique, a Jewish technique. Gematria is where the Jewish people gave numbers to their letters. So every letter of the alphabet has a numerical value assigned to it. So the first 9 letters of the alphabet are 1 to 9, then it goes up in tens, and then it goes up in hundreds. So if I took my name, for example, M equals 40, A equals 1, so the first letter, R equals 200, and K equals 20. So you'd add the numbers together, and you'd get, thankfully, not 666, but you'd get 261, which is a great relief that means I'm probably not the Antichrist. Now, what is the number of the beast? We're told that this leader, his name has a number to it, has a numerical value. The number is not 666. I don't want to show up Alan here, because when he read it, he read 666, because that's what we're told it is. The number is not 666. What is the number? Can you see? Sorry, this sounds like I'm being really picky here. It's 666. It's not 3 6s. It's 666. In other words, 600 plus 60 plus 6. That might sound like I'm being I'm splitting hairs there, because there could obviously be significant overlap. But if somebody said to you, there are 2 4 hours in the day, you'd say, "What you mean? There's 24 hours in the day?" So yeah, 2 4, same thing. Well, no, that could be a little bit different. So for example, that number there, that's not 500, is it? That's 500. That's 311. That's 666. Right? So I'm teaching Granny to suck eggs here, I know, but it's the point. It's 666 because it's written out. This is how it's written out. This is how John wrote it. He didn't write the numbers. He wrote out the words, 666. Can you see at the beginning of each of these words here, we've got, this is the word hex, as in hexagon, like 6-sided shape. So this is 660 and 6. So the mark of the beast is not 3 6s, it's 666. This is important because Christians can get this wrong sometimes. Back in the 1980s, for example, this is a silly example. Back in the 1980s, some Christians in America thought Ronald Reagan was the beast because his name was Ronald Wilson Reagan. 6 letters, 6 letters, 6 letters. But you see, he'd have to have 666 letters in his name to actually make the connection, because it's not 666, it's 666. Now, many people have done this Gemetria, it's working out the value of somebody's name, to find a world leader that has 666 as the value of their name. And there's one who sticks out like a sore thumb. It's the Emperor Nero. The Emperor Nero was certainly a beast. Whether he is the person spoken of here, he was certainly a beast, the most famous persecutor of Christians. It's a bit complicated, but I'm going to simplify it as best I understand it. I hope I haven't oversimplified this. But there's essentially 2 ways of going about it. For either one, you could put Nero's name into Hebrew. When you put it into Hebrew, the value, Hebrew was the language that John's readers spoke, because they know the Old Testament. If you put Nero's name, Nero Caesar, into Hebrew and add it up, you get 666. The second way of doing it is that there was an inscription on the Roman coins that said in Latin, Nero, this was the inscription on the coins that they used to buy and sell. Nero Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. And if you add that up in Latin, that gets to 666. Here's the problem. There are 2 ways to spell Nero's name. And so depending on the way you spell it, depends on whether it comes to 666 or not. If you were in the eastern part of the empire, Nero's name was spelt different. So if you had a coin in the east, it wouldn't add up to 666. Instead, it would add up to 616 because you'd miss an N. An N had the value of 50. So you'd be 50 short of 666. You'd have 616, 616. Here's the interesting part. You say, what's the point of this? Here's the interesting part. In the eastern part of the empire, where they had that different spelling, the manuscripts of Revelation say that the number of the beast is 616, not 666. So it looked as if the Christians in the East, where they had the different spelling of Nero's name, they didn't want people in their society to miss out on John's points. So they altered the number so that they would still realize it was Nero that John was speaking about, despite the difference in spelling on their coins. If Nero is the beast, if he's the Antichrist, who is, those titles are often linked, he fits the chapter quite nicely. We're told that the beast had 7 heads. Revelation tells us that the 7 heads are 7 hills and 7 kings. Well, we know what the 7 hills are. Rome was the 7-hilled city. It's the city of Rome. So when you say the 7 heads of the beast, the 7 heads are 7 hills, which are 7 kings, then we're to take that those are 7 Roman emperors. So Revelation 17 says, this calls for a mind of wisdom, the same as this chapter says, Revelation 13. This calls for a mind of wisdom. 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They're 7 kings. 5 of those kings have fallen. 1 is, so the 6th one is currently in operation. And the 7th one has not yet come, but when he comes, he'll only be around a short while. Some Christians say this fits Nero very nicely. 5 kings had gone, 5 Caesars had come and gone. He was the 6th, and a 7th would come, the Emperor Galba, who would only reign for a short time, as Revelation 17 says. So Nero fits the 6th head of the beast, that head that was wounded and seemed to die, came back to life. Now, Nero was the big persecutor of Christians, and we're told that the beast had a fatal wound but came back to life. Some Christians had stories that Nero had come back to life. Some Christians say that there were stories of those days Nero had come back to life, or perhaps that some of the later emperors who persecuted the church were almost like Nero back from the dead, that sort of thing. Also, the beast persecuted Christians for how long? 42 months. Remember, if you go back to these here, 42 months. I was right back at the beginning, wasn't it? How long did Nero persecute Christians for? 42 months, starting with the end of AD 64 and going on to June of AD 68, 42 months, 3.5 years. Like the beast, Nero also set up an image of himself, in one occasion a 100-foot statue of his own image for people to worship. Nero also blasphemed God, calling himself divine and the Son of God. And as for this not being able to buy and sell, unless you had the mark of the beast, of course, Nero's head and his name, his divine title, was on the coins that you had to buy and sell with. And in those days, if my information is correct, there's what is called the libellus, which is a document you could get to say that you acknowledged that Caesar, Nero Caesar, was the Son of God. And if you offered your pinch of incense on the altar of Caesar, and you said, Caesar is Lord, then you got this document that allowed you to buy and sell. The Christians, of course, reacted against that. No, Jesus is Lord. A direct opposition to Caesar is Lord. Nero seems to be the most likely candidate for the beast or the Antichrist here. So either the Antichrist is Nero, and all these prophecies were fulfilled in that time and in the destruction of Jerusalem, or at the very least, John is using the language of Nero to describe the beast. In other words, the beast will be a Nero-like figure. His reign will be reminiscent of that great persecutor of the church. The dragon will use the same tactics throughout history, and perhaps at the end of history as well. All Revelation is saying that throughout the history of the church, Christians can expect Nero-like figures, tyrants who come and go, who persecute Christians for a short time. We come to the end of our time here, and we're just going to have to, we might have to move some things till next time when we're together. Let me just raise another thing that I think is interesting, and about 666, or 666, I should say. Does that number ever pop up in the Old Testament? It does. There are 2 occasions when it pops up in the Old Testament in connection with Solomon. Same incident told twice. I'll go through my slides again. I'll try and find it. Here we go. Right. Oh, too far. There we go. Right. Do you remember when the Queen of Sheba visits Solomon in 1 Kings 10, and it's in Chronicles as well? It's repeated. You have this description of Solomon's wealth and all of the gold and silver and possessions that he owns. And we have these lists of things. And we have all these numbers here of things that he owns. And what you notice about the numbers is they're all round numbers. So Solomon's wealth is all rounded up or down to give us round totals. 120 talents of gold, 600 shekels of silver, and so on and so on. There is only one number in Solomon's empire that is not a rounded number. And the number is 666 to describe the tax that he accrued from the nations around him. It's interesting that this leads into Solomon's downfall as he sort of prostitutes himself out to the nations and has all these sort of pagan and godless wives who then take his heart away from the Lord and to other masters, to pagan masters. Then the nation completely capitulates, it collapses, it's divided in two under Solomon's sons because of going away from the Lord, and then eventually they go into exile and Jerusalem's destroyed and the nation's kaput. It is interesting we have a similar thing in Revelation, where the Jewish people rejected the Messiah. The Jewish authorities, by and large, came under God's judgment, and the nation would be destroyed. They went away from the Lord. They prostituted themselves out like an adulterous woman to the Roman Empire, and Jerusalem was again destroyed. I don't want to base too much on this Solomon thing. This is a bit of a I don't want to base too much on an obscure passage from the Old Testament like that. But let me just sum up, and then we'll we'll go to bed and dream about beasts and dragons. Okay. And just sum up. We'll just have to save some things till next time and see where we go from there. Is John speaking about the past or the future or even the present? Is he giving us principles that apply through history or to a specific point in history? Well, he certainly uses language that's familiar to his ancient readers. He uses the Nero language. He uses Roman language. That's the context they were living in. That's the persecution they faced. If you're writing to Christians in the first century, you're going to use their language. You're going to speak about the things they're going through because it applies first and foremost to them. If you wanted to use an example of a beast in first century Middle East, you'd use Nero. That's the language you'd use. People today, if we wanted to use an example of a beast, the language we would use would be of Hitler and Nazi Germany or something like that, right? Maybe in the future people will use Putin and the Russian government. I don't know. But John definitely uses their language. That doesn't rule out that there's future fulfillments to this. There's examples of this in the Bible. When Jesus speaks of hell, he uses the word Gehenna, which was an actual place in his day. It was a rubbish dump outside of the city where the fire never went out. That doesn't mean there's not a real hell because Jesus used the language of Gehenna. It was that language, that place, that dump where the fire never went out was symbolic of the reality of hell. So maybe this Nero language is symbolic of a future Nero-like figure. That's possible as well. There are lots of examples of that in the Bible. The Valley of Achor is used, this Valley of Trouble is used of a symbolic of going through troubled times and that sort of thing. So this doesn't rule out a future application simply because this is ancient language and Roman Empire language. We're given a window really into Satan's devices. What are Satan's strategies? Well, God pulls back the curtain and shows us. He uses political figures and religious figures to oppose the church. But we also get a picture of Satan's ultimate defeat and the victory of the church as they endure through Christ. And the consummation of that victory, that is certainly future, as Revelation explains by the end of the book. You've read the last page of Revelation, right? And the church wins in the end through Christ. Christ and his church are victorious, therefore, in every generation, as a litany of beasts, a catalogue of beasts address the church. We are victorious still. There are two ways that life is being presented in Revelation and through this picture as well. Either you serve the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Father, the Lamb, and the Spirit in Revelation, or you serve the unholy Trinity, the dragon and the two beasts, the Antichrist and the false prophet. Either you have the name of God and the Lamb on your foreheads, or you have the name of the beast on your foreheads. Either you're shaped by the Lamb and his way of life and you follow him wherever he goes, or you serve the beast. Those two things are put side by side, Revelation 13, Revelation 14. Either you worship the Lamb, or you worship the one who looks like a lamb but is really a dragon. Either you worship the king on the 7 hills, or you worship, chapter 14, the Lamb on Mount Zion on his throne. So Satan's given us these poor substitutes for the real thing. You've got to serve one or the other, the real thing or the poor substitute. It looks as if the beast and the dragon are the better one. They seem to be winning. They seem to be all powerful throughout history, as Nero did in John's day, or some future emperor did in John's day. And many Christians were martyred under those Roman emperors. But the beast is only temporary, 42 months, 3.5 years, whereas the triumph of Christ is everlasting. That's what we're told over and over again. The persecution is short. It's 3.5 years, 42 months, and however many days that is given in Revelation as well. But the triumph is everlasting. So it says in the next chapter, there will be no rest or night for those who worship the beast in his image, for anyone who receives the mark of his name. So their defeat will be everlasting. And then John applies it with the exact same words. He applies it in this chapter. This calls for patient endurance on the part of God's people who keep his commands and remain faithful to Jesus. I'm just going to leave it there, okay? And we'll pick up next week. But I'll pray, and then if you need to go, you can go. As John says, those who are led into captivity be led into captivity. Those who can stay and chat can stay and chat. Okay. Lord Jesus, we thank you for our time together, even if some of these things very much confuse us, and we can't really get our heads around all the things here. And Lord, we admit we could be very wrong about these things, because we know Christians have disagreed, and very godly men and women have had very different opinions. And so, Lord, we don't want to put ourselves above every other Christian by thinking we've got a grasp on this. Help us to have wisdom, but also humility about your word. In Jesus' name we ask. Amen. I hope that sheds some light on some of the big pictures, some of the overarching pictures there.
I felt that it very nicely linked the Old and the New Testament, and it's the best interpretation that I've heard so far.
You didn't give up on me like you gave up on the two books, at least.
No, he's still here.
I'm still here.
Well, I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Lot of work went into that.
As you say, I mean, I've always felt that there was a relevance to the time of those people, but I couldn't put the flesh on the bones of the theory, as it were, which you've managed to do. Thank you.
But you can see it in any generation.
Yes,
yeah,
right.
You
which
can,
is like you can for other parts of Revelation.
yeah. They went through some pretty extreme stuff.
Yeah.
If it is under Nero,
Yeah.
and that's a big debate, because some think it's under a later emperor, Domitian, where the persecution is probably more localized, maybe to these 7 churches in Asia Minor, in which case it would be relevant to them. Some think that's the reference to the resurrection of the head, or Domitian. When he came, he was like Nero. He'd been like Nero's raised from the dead. Because not all emperors persecuted Christians, of course, but Nero and Domitian did. But yeah, that's a big debate as to where the book's written, and the early date under Nero is the harder case to make. Just so you're aware of that.
But it's interesting, the point that we talked about last time, as to whether the epistles and Revelation was written before or after AD 70.
Yep.
Is actually quite crucial, isn't it?
Yes.
It sounds as though it was before. Originally.
It's hard to discern whether the temple's still standing.
Yeah.
In Jerusalem when these things are written.
Right.
But it certainly seems that the language is very Nero-esque. Whether Nero is the person who's there at the time, or whether he's just using that language as symbolic of the beastly opposition.